It was an ordinary building in a sprawling city, the kind of place people passed by without a second glance. Its exterior was dull and gray, its windows perpetually smudged with streaks of rain and pollution. Inside, however, the building buzzed with life. A mix of exhausted workers, noisy families, and solitary souls, each caught in the flow of their day-to-day lives. But there was one thing that all the residents avoided talking about. One thing that made the building's humdrum existence feel just a little off. The elevator. It wasn't just old, though it creaked and groaned with every trip. There was something else about it. Something that made people hesitate before stepping inside, even if they were running late. Rumors spread like wildfire among the residents, whispered in hushed tones in the laundry room or while checking the mail. "It's cursed," one elderly tenant had muttered to a young couple when they first moved in. Her eyes were wide with the memory of something she wouldn't fully explain. "I've seen things, heard things. If you ever hear crying in there, don't go in." At first, they dismissed it as nonsense, an old woman's way of spicing up her day. But as weeks passed, they began hearing stories from other tenants. Stories of late-night rides interrupted by a faint, heart-wrenching sob, of buttons lighting up on their own, as if an invisible passenger had chosen a floor. And most chilling of all, stories of people who had gone into the elevator after hearing the crying and never came back out. It was on a stormy evening when Mia, a nurse who worked the night shift, found herself standing before the elevator doors. She just finished a brutal double shift and was too tired to climb the stairs to her apartment on the 12th floor. Her shoes were soaked from the rain, and her eyelids felt like lead. The lobby was silent except for the soft patter of water dripping from her coat. She pressed the worn, grime-covered button, leaning against the wall with a sigh. As the elevator descended, she noticed something strange. The floor display above the doors flickered erratically, skipping numbers. It stopped at random floors, dinging softly before continuing its descent. By the time it reached her, the display read 6. The doors groaned open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Mia stepped in and hit the button for her floor. Just as the doors began to close, she heard it. A faint, muffled sobbing. It sounded like a child, a small one, crying softly somewhere behind her. The sound made her stomach twist. She turned quickly, expecting to see a little boy or girl curled up in the corner. But the elevator was empty. Her pulse quickened as the crying continued, echoing softly against the steel walls. It wasn't coming from inside the elevator. It was coming from above it. The hairs on Mia's arms stood on end. She stared up at the ceiling panel, her reflection trembling in the polished surface. The sobbing grew louder, turning into sharp, panicked gasps, as if the child couldn't catch their breath. She pressed the button for the next floor, desperate to get off, but the elevator didn't stop. It was climbing now, moving faster than it should. The crying turned into screams, agonized, blood-curdling screams that rattled her very bones. Mia slammed her fists against the buttons, but they wouldn't respond. The lights began to flicker, and the air grew colder. Her breath fogged in front of her face. And then the elevator stopped. The doors slid open to reveal nothing, just a gaping black void. Not a hallway, not a floor, just darkness, thick and endless. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Mia froze, unable to move, her eyes locked on the abyss. Then, something moved in the darkness. A pale, bony hand emerged, gripping the edge of the elevator door. Another hand followed, and then ahead a small, childlike head, but its features were wrong. Its eyes were too big, black and empty, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as though carved with a jagged knife. The thing tilted its head, studying her, before whispering in a voice that was both childlike and inhuman. "Why won't you help me?" Mia screamed. The doors slammed shut, and the elevator plummeted. When it finally stopped, the doors opened to the lobby. Mia stumbled out, gasping for air, her knees shaking. The lobby was empty, as silent as it had been when she entered. She looked back at the elevator, expecting it to be gone, but it sat there as if nothing had happened. And then she heard it again, the crying. This time, it was coming from behind her. Mia whipped around, her breath hitching in her throat. The lobby stretched out before her, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Rain streaked down the glass doors at the building's entrance, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed outside. But the crying, soft, pitiful, and unrelenting, seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the building. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run outside into the storm, and never look back. But the sound of the child's sobbing rooted her in place. There was something undeniably human about it, something that clawed at the nurse in her. What if it was real? What if a child was lost, scared, or hurt? Clenching her fists to steady her shaking hands, Mia called out into the empty lobby. "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" The crying didn't stop. It didn't answer her either. It just lingered. The sound seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. It echoed faintly from the stairwell, from the mailroom, even from the dark corners of the ceiling. She stepped forward, her wet shoes squeaking against the tiles. The crying grew louder with each step, guiding her like an invisible thread. It led her past the mailboxes, past the stairwell, and into a narrow corridor she rarely used. It was the maintenance hallway, lined with gray doors that she assumed led to supply closets and utility rooms. The crying stopped abruptly. Mia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked around, the silence pressing against her ears. Then came a single sound, a soft, wet tap-tap-tap on the floor behind her. She turned slowly, feeling a chill creep down her spine. The lights in the lobby were still flickering, casting uneven shadows across the walls. At first, she saw nothing, just the empty corridor and the elevator sitting motionless at the end. But then, just as the light flickered again, she saw it. Small, bare footprints, wet, as if someone had stepped out of a pool, leading from the elevator to where she now stood. They stopped a few feet in front of her and disappeared, as though their owner had simply vanished. Her breath caught in her throat as the crying resumed, louder this time, coming from one of the maintenance doors to her left. She hesitated, her mind racing, every rational part of her screamed to turn around and leave. But her legs betrayed her, moving toward the door as if pulled by an unseen force. The sobbing grew clearer, sharper. It sounded like a little girl now, hiccuping between her cries. Mia's trembling hand reached for the doorknob, which was cold and slick under her fingers. She twisted it and pushed the door open. Inside was darkness, open, front of her, and disappeared, as though their owner had simply vanished. A faint metallic smell wafted out, sharp and unmistakable blood. Mia gagged, instinctively covering her mouth and nose. The crying seemed to come from deep within the room, echoing off unseen walls. She fumbled for the light switch, but found none. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The crying stopped again, and then came the voice. "You shouldn't have opened the door." It was the same childlike voice she'd heard in the elevator, but now it was clearer, closer. It sounded like it was right next to her ear. Mia staggered back, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut before she could escape, plunging her into complete darkness. Something brushed past her leg, cold, wet, and soft like a tiny hand. She screamed, spinning around, but the room was pitch black. The only sound now was her own panicked breathing, each breath coming faster and faster until she thought her chest would burst. And then the light came on. It wasn't the fluorescent overhead light she had been expecting. Instead, it was a dim, sickly yellow glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The room wasn't a utility closet at all. It was much larger, a long, narrow space lined with rows of rusty lockers and pipes dripping with condensation. The metallic smell was stronger here, almost overpowering. And in the middle of the room stood a figure. It was a child, a little girl in a tattered white dress, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. She was facing away from Mia, her small shoulders trembling as if she were crying again. But no sound came from her now. Mia's throat felt dry as she forced out a shaky, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl stopped trembling, her head tilted to the side, unnaturally far, as though her neck was made of rubber. Slowly, she turned to face Mia. Her face, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque mockery of human features. Her eyes were hollow pits, dripping with black quire that ran down her cheeks. Her mouth was far too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a jagged, bloody grin. And yet, somehow, she still looked like she was crying. The girl's head twitched, her grin growing wider. "Will you play with me?" Before Mia could react, the girl lunged forward impossibly fast, her bony fingers clawing at Mia's arms. The room spun as Mia screamed, her vision blurring. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the girl's face inches from hers, those empty eyes boring into her soul. When the maintenance man found Mia the next morning, she was sitting in the lobby, soaked to the bone. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her lips moving soundlessly, as if she were whispering to someone who wasn't there. The elevator dinged softly behind her, the doors sliding open to reveal nothing but an empty car. But the maintenance man swore he could hear it, the faint sound of a child crying. The maintenance man, an older fellow named Victor, who had worked in the building for over 2 decades, froze in the lobby, his toolbox clattering to the floor. The sound echoed sharply, but Mia didn't react. She remained seated on the damp tiles, her body eerily still except for her lips, which kept moving, forming words too faint to be heard. Victor wasn't a superstitious man, but the building had its share of peculiarities, things he never dared to admit bothered him. Residents disappearing, lights flickering with no explanation, and that damn elevator, which he avoided as much as possible. His hand trembled as he knelt in front of Mia. "Mia," he called gently, his voice rough and uncertain. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Her eyes, bloodshot and wide, snapped to his face, startling him. It wasn't just fear in her gaze. It was something deeper, something broken. Her mouth stopped moving for a moment, and she tilted her head, much like the childlike figure Victor had heard rumors about. "They won't leave," she whispered. Victor blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Who won't leave?" Her lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "The ones in the elevator. They keep crying. They want someone to stay with them." Victor recoiled, his stomach knotting. He didn't want to press her further, but something about her tone made him glance toward the elevator. Its door stood open, like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow someone whole. Later that day, the building buzzed with gossip. Residents whispered about the ambulance that had come to take Mia away. Some claimed they'd seen her being wheeled out, screaming about the crying children and clawing at her own skin as though trying to remove something crawling beneath it. Victor tried to shake it off, throwing himself into his work. But the atmosphere in the building had shifted. Shadows seemed darker, lingering longer in the corners of the hallways. The air felt heavier, oppressive. Even the tenants, normally loud and full of life, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the elevator whenever they passed by it. Victor decided to check the elevator that evening, more out of obligation than bravery. The maintenance requests had piled up, lights flickering, buttons sticking, and doors jamming randomly. He told himself it was nothing unusual, just old equipment acting up, but his hands still shook as he entered the elevator shaft access room in the basement. The air down there was freezing, and it smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic like rust or blood. Victor switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed off the concrete walls, though he couldn't see where it was coming from. He approached the elevator's control panel, an old, boxy unit covered in grime and cobwebs. As he opened it to inspect the wiring, he noticed something strange. The control panel had scratches on it, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. "What the hell?" he muttered, leaning closer. That's when he heard it, a faint sniffle. Victor froze. The sound was so soft that he thought he'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakably the sound of a child crying. It echoed faintly through the shaft, seeming to rise from below. Victor's flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering as if struggling against the darkness. His pulse quickened, and he stepped back, aiming the light at the elevator car above him. It sat idle a few floors up, its underside caked with grease and dirt. The crying grew louder, more frantic. It sounded as if it were coming from directly below him now, somewhere deep in the pit of the elevator shaft. Victor hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But something compelled him to stay. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt, or maybe the faint hope that he could finally put an end to the bizarre events plaguing the building. Carefully, he leaned over the edge of the shaft, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom below. At first, all he could see were the thick steel cables and the darkness stretching downward. But then he spotted it movement. At the very bottom of the shaft, huddled in the shadows, was a small figure. "Hey!" Victor called out, his voice shaking. "Kid, what are you doing down there?" The figure didn't respond. It remained crouched, its back to him, trembling as though it were cold or crying. Victor's heart raced as he realized how impossible this was. There was no way for anyone to get down there without equipment, and even then, it would have been suicidal. "Stay there," he shouted, though his voice cracked. "I'll get help." He turned to leave, but as he stepped away from the edge, the crying stopped. "Don't leave me." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it sent a chill down Victor's spine. He turned back, and the figure was no longer at the bottom of the shaft. It was closer now, much closer, clinging to the elevator cables, its pale, emaciated limbs wrapped around them like a spider. Victor stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. The figure's head tilted upward, revealing a face so grotesque it made his stomach churn. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. "Stay," it whispered, its voice a sickening mix of childlike innocence and malice. Victor bolted. The next morning, the elevator was out of service, its doors jammed shut, and the display flickering erratically. Victor was gone. His apartment was empty, and no one had seen him leave. The building's residents assumed he'd quit, fed up with the eerie happenings. But those who paid attention noticed something strange. Late at night, when the building was quiet and the elevator was still, you could hear it, the faint sound of Victor's toolbox rattling, and the distant cry of a child. The elevator remained sealed off for weeks, declared unsafe by management. A hastily printed notice taped to its doors warned tenants to use the stairs until further notice. Some residents muttered about finding a new place to live, while others carried on as if nothing had happened, trying to ignore the strange occurrences and unexplained absences that seemed to plague the building. But late at night, whispers filled the halls. People claimed they could still hear it, the crying, faint but unmistakable, emanating from somewhere deep within the building. Some even said they heard Victor's voice, low and muffled, calling out for help. 2 months later, the new maintenance man arrived. His name was Carlos, a no-nonsense type who'd spent years working in old, crumbling buildings. He'd heard the rumors about this place, the crying, the disappearances, but he didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, it was just another job. The elevator was his first priority. Management was pushing for it to be fixed, claiming complaints from tenants had skyrocketed since it went out of service. Carlos spent his first day inspecting the controls, cables, and machinery. Everything seemed normal, albeit outdated. He replaced the frayed wires, tested the brakes, and even cleaned out the shaft, muttering under his breath about the mess Victor had left behind. When the elevator finally roared to life, Carlos felt a swell of pride. "Piece of cake," he muttered, wiping grease from his hands. That night, the tenants hesitated to use the elevator, wary of its sudden return to operation. But eventually, someone had to try it. It was Mrs. Alvarez, a middle-aged woman who lived on the 8th floor. She was carrying a week's worth of groceries and decided she wasn't about to haul them up the stairs. She pressed the button, the ding sounding sharp and clear in the otherwise silent lobby. The doors slid open, revealing the familiar interior. It looked the same as always, dingy, with scuffed walls and a faint musty smell. She stepped inside, pressed 8 and waited. The elevator began its ascent, moving smoothly at first. But as it passed the 3rd floor, it shuddered slightly. Mrs. Alvarez frowned, gripping her bags tighter. Then she heard it, a faint sniffle. Her stomach dropped. She turned her head slowly, scanning the empty corners of the elevator. The sound grew louder, turning into soft, hiccuping sobs. She reached out to press the emergency button, but before her finger could touch it, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the elevator into darkness. The sobbing stopped, and then, from the corner of the pitch-black elevator, came a voice. "Why won't anyone help me?" Mrs. Alvarez screamed as the elevator began to plummet, the metal walls screeching around her. Carlos was awoken at 3 a.m. by his phone vibrating on the bedside table. Groggy and annoyed, he answered it. "There's a problem with the elevator," said the voice on the other end, a tenant from the second floor. It's making noises again." And Mrs. Alvarez never came back from the lobby. Carlos groaned, dragging himself out of bed. He dressed quickly and made his way down to the lobby, his tools jangling in his bag. When he arrived, the elevator doors were open, revealing an empty car. It was eerily silent, except for a faint metallic creak coming from somewhere deep in the shaft. Carlos stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The floor panel was lit up, but the car hadn't moved. "Mrs. Alvarez?" he called, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. No response. Carlos reached for the emergency access panel and pried it open. He leaned down to look into the shaft, his flashlight beam scanning the depths. And there, far below, he saw her. Mrs. Alvarez's body was crumpled at the bottom of the shaft, her groceries scattered around her like broken offerings. Her head was twisted at an unnatural angle, her unseeing eyes staring up at him. Carlos staggered back, ball rising in his throat. He reached for his radio to call for help, but before he could speak, the elevator doors slammed shut behind him. The car jolted violently, the lights flickering. Carlos slammed his fists against the doors, shouting for help, but the elevator didn't respond. Instead, it began to rise, faster and faster, the floor numbers blinking past in a blur. The crying started again, soft and pitiful at first, but quickly growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't just one voice this time. It was a chorus of children, their sobs overlapping, filling the elevator with an unbearable cacophony. Carlos pressed himself against the wall, his chest heaving as panic set in. The crying turned into laughter, high-pitched, mocking, and inhuman. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment he saw them. The children. They were packed into the elevator with him, their small, emaciated bodies pressed against the walls. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow and black, their mouths stretched into jagged grins. "Stay with us," one of them whispered, its voice cutting through the chaos. Carlos screamed as the elevator came to a sudden, violent stop. The next morning, the building was quiet. Tenants murmured about the strange noises they'd heard overnight. The distant sound of crying and laughter, followed by an ear-splitting crash. When the police arrived, they found the elevator doors wide open, the car sitting at the lobby level. Inside was Carlos's toolbox, its contents scattered across the floor. Carlos was never found. The elevator was sealed off again, its doors chained shut, and a fresh notice taped to them. But the tenants knew it wouldn't help. Late at night, when the building was silent and the shadows grew long, the crying could still be heard. It wasn't just the elevator. It was the building itself,